morning and welcome to Driving Force Radio, where we seek to discover what drives today's leaders. My co-host today is Kelly De La Torre from ALG Attorneys. Kelly, as you know, is a great energy attorney here in town. She leads the Rocky Mountain Women in Energy organization. And as always, we have these fantastic conversations about energy and the roles they play in your world. And today is no different, Kel.
Yep, I'm excited to be here again, Jan. Thanks for having me.
You bet. And welcome to the show. You know, today's show is really about talking about transformation. Sometimes we focus on transformation, but we don't say it exactly that way. And today's show is really about transformations all over the place.
Yeah, and we've talked before about how we use energy to make our lives better, and so we talk about, like, we want to cut our energy use, but we still want a hot shower. And in the transportation sector, we like our personal automobiles, and me in particular, I've looked at public transport, and I have looked at ways where I could ride my bike to work and still pick up my kids, and I just can't make it work right now for me with the age of my kids, and so I need
your daughter can't ride on the handlebars, Kelly.
I need my personal automobile, and so today we're looking at how can we get that, but how can we transform the auto industry into something that has less emissions, that we use less energy, and we still get that personal satisfaction.
Absolutely, and you know, with over 850 million cars and trucks on the road just here in the United States, that's not globally, that's just here in the United States. We're going to be taking a look today at the advantages of new technology and design approaches around some of these effects that those vehicles caused with traditional energy sources. We're going to be looking at the future of urban and personal transportation and what we're going to need to do in terms of infrastructure, in terms of design, in terms of technology to get that done. And so today should be a great show. Bob Yuhnke is the director of the transportation program at the Southwest Energy Efficiency Project, SWEEP, based in Boulder, Colorado. He has an in-depth knowledge of experience and knowledge in transportation planning and clean air initiatives. He's served on the Transportation Advisory Committee for the Denver Regional Council of Governments and has represented environmental organizations during the rewrite of federal transportation law in 1998, as well as in 2003 through 2005. Bob, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Before we jump in, some of these numbers are really amazing and can provide some context to our discussion. So like you said, we own 850 million cars and trucks, nearly all powered by internal combustion engines. We, as Americans, drive 3 trillion miles a year on 4 million miles of roads, consuming 180 billion gallons of fuel each year, dispensed from 170,000 service stations.
And that's just here in the U.S. I mean, we're not talking about the global impact of that. That's just here in the U.S. And those numbers are shocking to me, and I'm stunned by that. But when you think about these developing countries, China, India, those BRIC countries, and you think about what they're doing in terms of their vehicles and transportation, I mean, these are some critical issues.
Yeah, and China is set on their growth rate that if they stay on their growth rate, they're set to surpass the U.S. by 2030, and then India is not far behind. So this is a serious issue. And then it also translates into our economy. The auto industry is really important to our economy here in the U.S. At least 14 million U.S. jobs are tied directly or indirectly to producing and servicing automobiles, building and maintaining roads, supplying fuel, and governing infrastructure. So this makes personal transportation a major economic engine for the
and
US.
If I'm not mistaken, I know that just the auto industry itself and its suppliers and vendors represent about 20% of our overall manufacturing output here in the U.S. It's an amazing industry. It's huge, and there are a lot of implications on the way this goes forward as we look at this.
Yeah, and once again, we're at it seems like we're at a transition point. And Bob, I just want to say your background is so impressive, and it's given the magnitude of this issue, it's so nice to know that there are people like you that are leading this effort. So thanks for coming and telling us about what you're doing and being here today.
Partly a function of just being on the planet for so long.
Well, throughout your career, you've focused on clean air and environmental compliance, and for more than a decade, you've been heavily involved in the transportation sector. Can you provide sort of your perspective of the history of the transportation sector, and where do we sit now? Are we at a transformation, or and what do we need to do right now?
Well, I came to focusing on transportation issues from the standpoint of cleaning up the air, because automobiles account for half of the ozone pollution in our cities. And as you know, Denver is a city where ozone is the primary pollutant that we have levels that violate the national health standards. And many other major cities in the U.S. Are trying to solve their ozone problem too. So from that perspective, I've been involved in air pollution policy going back to the 70s, but I started getting involved in the transportation aspect of it beginning right around the rewrite of the Clean Air Act in 1990. And what we're seeing here for the first time with the possibility of electrifying our vehicles is the possibility of virtually eliminating ozone pollution from automobiles. That is, to me, very exciting because the pollution in our air threatens our kids. It contributes to asthma. It accounts for a lot of the problems that elderly people have with emphysema and COPD. And if we were able to electrify most of the personal vehicles that we have, this problem would virtually disappear. We would have solved it forever. So from my standpoint, getting involved in helping break down the barriers to electric vehicles is one of the ways in which I can contribute to making the world a better place for my grandchildren. Right. You know, which is my primary focus these days. Those are the two little beings on the planet that I spend most of my time focusing on. And so it of course, it helps everybody. Absolutely. But the basic problem is that we're dealing with a new technology, and most people have a little bit of a natural hesitance to getting involved in a new technology. They don't see their neighbor with an electric car. They don't see very many of them driving down the road. As far as we know right now, there are only 1,200 electric vehicles registered in Colorado. Wow. So we don't have a lot of them. Yeah. And so most people are curious. They're checking it out. Yeah. They want to know more. Yeah. But they're not ready to go out and plunk down $25,000 on something that they don't feel totally comfortable with. Right. So part of what we're doing at SWEEP is to help reduce some of the barriers, both the cost barriers and the convenience issues, because also you don't see a lot of places to go plug in your car. Right. Yeah. So that's one of the issues with electric vehicles is it's very convenient from the standpoint of being able to plug in at home, because you can virtually eliminate the need to go to a gas station with an electric vehicle. You can get rid of that part of your life. Yeah. You can come home, plug in at night, car's ready to go in the morning, you've got a full battery, and as long as you're going to be driving distances that are within the range of your battery, it's very convenient.
Bob, that brings me to the question of, so what are the barriers to electric vehicle ownership?
The biggest barrier is the incremental cost. To get a battery vehicle, you have to pay for a big battery, and the battery cost is significantly more than a gas tank. And that's adding to the purchase price of the vehicle, although the overall cost of ownership is less over the long term because the cost of electricity is a lot less than the cost of gasoline. So for example, to drive the same distance that you would drive on a gallon of gasoline, on electricity it costs you $1.25, whereas you're paying $3.50 for the gasoline. So that adds up over the life of a vehicle to savings in the order of $15,000 to $16,000 if you keep that car for 10 or 15 years. But the initial cost is a problem because that's going to be anywhere from $10,000 to $12,000 or $15,000 more than your gasoline vehicle. But in Colorado, one of the things that we worked on when I first started at SWEEP was passing legislation that gave people a tax credit. So the idea is between now and 2016, if you buy an electric vehicle, you can save up to $6,000 on your state income tax. There's also a federal tax credit where you can save up to $7,500 on your federal taxes, so that together you can offset that incremental cost. And the idea was to provide a bridge over this time period where the industry is rapidly bringing down the costs of batteries. So in the beginning, the cost was higher because it was new technology and the industry was having to spread over the cost of developing the technology. But as we're going forward here, these costs of batteries are dropping quite rapidly. They've dropped in half in the last 4 years. And the experts in the field expect that it's going to drop in half again over the next 4 years. Wow. So by the time we get to the period where these tax credits are no longer available, hopefully the costs of electric vehicle batteries will have dropped enough so that the incremental cost of an electric vehicle is not that much higher than a gasoline vehicle.
Well, and Bob, I would assume that one of the barriers as well to the electric vehicle ownership is that a traditional vehicle, you see a gas station every 30 yards here in the United States, but you don't see the ability to go get clean energy fueling stations, if you will, hardly anywhere. And so I would assume that that's a barrier. And what's it going to take to really build an infrastructure that can support clean energy or clean vehicles?
Well, one of the reasons for that barrier was that until we passed House Bill 1258 this year in the Colorado legislature, it was illegal for someone to sell you electricity unless they first went to the Public Utilities Commission and got approval as a public utility. So this legislation that we passed just a couple months ago that the governor signed last month now eliminates that obligation. So you're no longer treated as a public utility if you sell electricity to someone who pulls up in their electric vehicle. So this now makes it possible for anybody like a Whole Foods or a gas station for that matter to install an electric charging facility and to allow you to plug in anywhere. Gotcha. So this is all new. This regulatory change is making it possible for all sorts of commercial interests to go out and set up these charging stations. The other thing that's happening, again, this is a field where the technology is advancing so quickly, is that we're moving into a realm where fast charging is going to become available routinely. Up until this year, there was no easy mechanism for making fast charging available. Even the cars didn't have a plug on the car to make it possible to plug into fast charging, at least some of the cars. Now that is all being resolved. The plugs are being standardized, and fast charging technology will be available within the next year or two, so that you will be able to pull up and recharge your battery within 20 to 30 minutes, instead of now where you really have to wait overnight. That's why charging at home is so convenient, because you can plug in the car for a number of hours when you're not going to be using it, and it's ready to go in the morning. But when you needed to charge during the day, if you went beyond the range of your battery, it might have taken a long time to get enough electricity back into your battery.
Bob, that is so interesting, and I know from the legislative sessions in both New Mexico and Colorado that passing legislation is never an easy task. So can you provide the listeners with a little bit of background as to what kind of studies did SWEEP do, and how did you explain this to the legislature, the importance of this? Because it seems like a big win for Colorado.
Well, with only 1,200 vehicles out there, there's not people banging on the doors saying we've got to be able to plug in our vehicle in the middle of the day, although that's coming. So Colorado is a leader in this, recognizing that this is where we want to be rather than this is where we are already. So try to get systems in place so it's possible to have these charging stations conveniently located wherever people want to go. And to convince the legislature that we should be out front on this rather than behind the curve, we did an economic analysis to show what the benefits to the state's economy would be if we were able to wean ourselves off of petroleum fuels and to start relying upon electricity that we generate here in the state. So petroleum fuels, we're all aware that most of it comes from outside of the country.
Right.
Some comes from Canada, but a lot of it comes from Venezuela and Africa and the Middle East. And we're currently spending roughly $1 billion a day in this country to buy petroleum.
A day.
To import it into the U.S.
And Kelly, worldwide, it's 18 million barrels of oil a day to drive cars.
Yeah, that's crazy.
I'm stunned. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Sorry, Bob.
And in the U.S., we import we use 19 million barrels a day. Now, that's not all for cars.
Right.
About 16 million of that is for cars. So most of the petroleum that we use is for our vehicles. And if we were able to plug in our vehicles and use electricity that we generate here at home, we would enrich our economy by keeping that wealth here. So we analyzed that just for Colorado. And what we were able to show is if we got to 30% of all light-duty vehicles being electric by 2030, which is a very realistic possibility, that we would save the state's economy roughly $11 billion in avoided petroleum fuel costs. Wow. So just for not buying gasoline at $3.50 a gallon and using electricity at $1.25 for a gallon equivalent, we would save $11 billion. And that's money that would stay here and create jobs in Colorado. So that was the kind of information that the legislators were interested in.
Sure.
They listened to that, and they recognized that making this transition and facilitating it is to our economic benefit.
And what do you think that, with only 1,200 cars being driven in Colorado right now, electric-powered cars, and we're talking right there, we're talking about all electric, right? Not the hybrids. Or is that both?
It probably includes
both.
It goes by vehicle registration.
Okay, so then it's probably in its own category. So then what would be the timing of this switchover? Like, are there things that we could do now to expedite that transition?
Well, the things that we are doing now is the tax credit, which we've talked about, and opening up the possibility of any commercial vendors offering electricity for sale. That's only a month on the statute books, so that's just beginning to get out there for commercial operators to understand that they can now do this legally. But there are a number of companies who are ready, standing in line, ready to start installing these kind of stations. So that's something we expect to see happen in the next year to 2 years.
Can I just interrupt for 1 second? So are those the charging stations? Is that technology? Are there any Colorado companies or technology? Was it developed here, or they're from all over that are going to develop here in partnership with these private companies? Is that right?
Well, the charging stations themselves, I don't think are being made in Colorado, but there are companies here that do install them. So you can get one installed in your home. You don't need a special charging station to plug in an electric car. You can plug in with a 110 volt line into the plug in your garage that's already there. That will take you normally 6 to 8 hours to charge the vehicle. But if you want to charge in half that time, you can get a charging station that uses a 220 line, which is the same voltage that you have for your dryer, if you have an electric dryer at home. So most houses already have 220 lines built in. You just have to run it to your garage. And those you can install those kind of stations as well. So a third policy initiative that we have initiated is to try to get the utilities to offer time of use rates for plugging in at night. Because at night is when we have the least demand for electricity.
Right.
Between 10 o'clock at night and 6 o'clock in the morning, we have so much excess capacity in the grid that we could convert all of the vehicles that we have today to electric and not exceed that excess capacity. In other words, we would never have to build another power plant if we are using the capacity that's not currently being used on the grid between 10 at night and 6 in the morning.
Right, yeah, that's amazing. So, but there's always, like I hear a lot, the pushback from the utilities saying that even though we have that excess capacity, that there's some kind of destabilizing effect. That if, say, everybody all in one neighborhood all of a sudden plugged their cars in at night, that they can't handle that excess capacity.
Well, this is something that we've discussed in detail with Xcel, which is the biggest public utility here in Colorado. And they're telling us that they have no capacity constraints between 10 at night and 6 in the morning. Even in a neighborhood where you've got a transformer that serves anywhere from 6 to 10 houses. If they were plugging in at night, that would not be a problem because the electric vehicles would not draw more power than the houses normally draw during the day.
Okay.
So if you think about it, during the day you're running your washer, you're running your dishwasher, you're running your electrical equipment, all your TVs and computers, and also your air conditioning.
Right.
So the capacity is there. Those things we're not using at night.
Right.
So if we're only plugging in our cars when we're not using all those other things, there's no problem.
Absolutely.
So we get to a constraint, a physical constraint in the grid, if we charge a lot of cars during the day when we're using all the other things.
Right.
So what we're discussing with the utilities is the idea that they should offer an incentive for people to use this excess capacity at night, because right now they're not generating any revenue. They're not,
right.
They're not selling electricity between 10 and 6 in the morning. If they could sell electricity during that time, they would gain more revenue for their current investment.
Yep.
So it would reduce the cost of power for everybody if they did that. Whereas if we charge our cars during the day and they have to build more power plants, we all have to pay for the additional power plants.
Yeah.
Right.
So our electricity costs would go up in that case.
Yeah.
So this, from our standpoint, makes a lot of sense. And some utilities, like in Arizona, they've already taken a major step forward and adopted this kind of time of use rate policy. And it's something that we are discussing with the utilities here in Colorado.
Well, Bob, we have to go to break. Kelly, we have to go to break. But to learn more about the Southwest Energy Efficiency Project, or SWEEP, where Bob Yuhnke is the director of the transportation programs out there, you go to swenergy.org and you can learn more there. And then, Kelly, as always, we can always learn more about women in energy here in the Rockies at
wie.globalnewenergynetwork.org or on my blog, rmenergyblog.blogspot.com.
Well, and when we come back, we will have more with Bob Yuhnke from SWEEP in Boulder, Colorado. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Driving Force Radio, where we seek to discover what drives today's leaders. My co-host today in this Energy 101 segment is Kelly De La Torre, an energy attorney at ALG Attorneys here in Denver. And Kelly, you always bring the most fascinating guests to the conversation, and it's so fun to have conversations with you because you get the political and public perceptions of it all. And I get to kind of tag along and learn a lot while we're at it.
Yeah, these are always really great conversations, and I am excited to get the information out there so that we can move things forward.
Well, and the interesting part of this show is we're talking about this transformation from traditional cars, if you will, and bridging to this new technology that's coming out in electric vehicles as well as plug-in electric vehicles. And I'm learning so much through this conversation today, but what I found so interesting is that, the U.S. automotive industry is obviously huge for jobs and job creation in this country. And, over the past 10 years, we've seen all kinds of things go on in that industry, but what we are seeing is that they're beginning to embrace this larger conversation about, you know, maybe we don't need everything to be 8 cylinders and 15 tires, but we can take it down to something that is much more economical and much more safe for the environment. And we are seeing that, and we're seeing that through legislation and public policy and public-private partnerships that are going on, and all different kinds of things. And we're going to talk about that this segment.
Yeah, and luckily we have one of the industry experts with us here today.
Bob Yuhnke, the director of the transportation program at the Southwest Energy Efficiency Project. That's SWEEP. And it's based in Boulder, Colorado. And Bob, thanks for being with us again in this segment.
Well, Jan, thank you so much for inviting me.
You know, you guys do such good work, and as we've learned more about the work that SWEEP is doing and the push that you're putting out there to sort of lead this conversation nationally and bridge the gap between traditional automotive and transportation solutions into this new conversation. I know that in the last segment we talked about House Bill 1258, which was passed here in Colorado. And for listeners in this segment, can you just give us a brief overview of House Bill 1258 and how that bridges the gap both locally as well as nationally and sort of serves as this national platform to really begin these conversations nationally?
Well, in most states, including Colorado, in order to sell electricity to the public, you need to get an approval from the Public Utilities Commission because it's a regulated activity. Mm-hmm. And so until House Bill 1258 was passed, it was illegal in Colorado for anyone other than a public utility to sell electricity to an electric vehicle owner.
And so is that why the infrastructure, if you will, where the charging station or the gas station, if you will, the electricity station for these vehicles, is that why we don't see very much of that, is because it has been illegal?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. This was a major barrier to commercial interests just going out and installing charging stations. I mean, even at a gasoline station, they couldn't legally install an electric vehicle charging facility without going to the Public Utilities Commission, going through the whole regulatory rigmarole, right, getting a certificate of public convenience, which most commercial interests, like if Whole Foods is now putting in charging stations, they wouldn't do that before because right, they had to go through this whole regulatory routine, you know, right, which is expensive. So we got rid of that. We opened up the marketplace so that it's no longer a monopoly to sell electricity. Anybody can do it. You buy the electricity from the utility and then you can sell it in your parking lot, you know, whatever kind of store you run. If you're a Come and Go or a 7-Eleven or whatever, now you can put in one of these stations. So it was just eliminating a major barrier to making these conveniently available to everybody.
And are we seeing other states follow suit? After 1258, are we seeing that, you know, I know here in the Rockies, there's a lot of people and organizations really pushing for clean vehicles, but even in cities where you see a lot of cars, are we seeing other states follow suit?
Well, we at SWEEP work in 6 states in the Southwest, and we are trying to shop House Bill 1258 to all the other states in which we work to get the same result. So we're working on that. But there are a handful of states have already done it. California, Washington State, Minnesota, I think Oregon. And that's about it. So there are other states that are now looking at this because they want to get ahead of the curve too. But at this point, Colorado is out there leading the way. And it's partly going to depend upon whether or not there are commercial interests who understand the value of being able to offer electric charging as a way of making some money. That's the way our economy works.
So if there are enterprises that are listening today, say a more local enterprise that's here in Colorado, and they're listening and they didn't know about 1258, are there, and I know it was just signed, so we probably don't know a lot of what's going to happen, but are there processes that they have to go through to figure out how they can do this? Like, do they have to?
Nope.
They don't have to make, so.
They don't have to get approval from anybody. They just have to make sure that they have enough electric power coming to their property to be able to supply the power needs of a charging station.
And they can do that simply by just working with their utility to figure that out?
They can work with the utility to figure that out, or they can just hire an electrical contractor.
Oh.
So you don't even...
So really simple.
It is really simple.
Wow.
We've made it simple.
So
What we also put in this bill was a provision allowing the electricity to be generated on site. So, for example, out at the airport, there are large parking facilities
Sure.
where they have solar collectors on the roof. Like, I don't know if I should mention the name of the company, but they have a solar collector on the roof, and they have electric charging stations in their parking facility.
at DIA?
At DIA.
I didn't
so
know
you can
that.
go out to the airport, park your car, get in the plane, and when you come back, it'll be charged.
Yeah, that's nice.
And so now they can use the electricity that they generate on their roof without buying it from the utility.
Love that.
And just as you can at home. If you are one of the Coloradans who's already invested in a solar system for your roof, you can plug your car into that
Oh.
and drive for free. You're not, your electricity basically is coming for free from the sun, and you can drive your car off of that.
Is there any concern that with since you don't actually have to check with Excel, if a number of businesses in the city were going to do charging during the day, we're going to reach capacity limits, do you think? Or that's maybe farther out since there's only 1,200 cars right now?
It is farther out, and the best estimates are that we might get to 10% of the vehicle fleet by 2020, and possibly 30% by 2030. So somewhere between the 10% number and the 30% number, we would start possibly running into some capacity constraints on the grid if a lot of the charging were happening during the daytime.
Yeah.
But most people are going to charge at home.
Yeah.
They're going to want a full battery when they leave in the morning. It's going to be cheaper to charge at home because you're not going to be paying a commercial vendor for the electricity who's going to have a markup. So your costs of charging at home are going to be less. And so that both the convenience of not having to stop and charge during the day and the cost will be an incentive for most people. But what we're also doing is discussing with the utilities and the Public Utilities Commission in a filing that we made last fall to try to get the utilities to set up time of use rates that will bring the cost down if you charge at night. Some other states have already done that. For example, in Arizona, they're already ahead of us. They've already put in place time of use rates where charging at night is almost 25% cheaper than charging at other times a day. So it brings your costs of driving down even more. So the average driver in Colorado, and nationally too, this is close, is about 11,000 miles a year. The cost of fuel now for a fuel-efficient vehicle, a new vehicle, for that number of miles is about $1,200 at today's price of gasoline. The cost of electricity in Colorado at current electric rates for that same number of miles is about $200.
Yeah.
So you're saving $1,000 a year just on fuel.
Wow.
Yeah.
And if we put time of use rates in place, we'll bring that $200 even further down to like $130.
Bob, I have to ask this because maybe I'm missing something here because, you know, I love my car and I'm certainly not riding a bike with my kids on it. But it seems like if consumers understood that argument, that here you are paying between $1,200 to $1,500 a year for gas for a newer vehicle versus I can drive the equivalent amount of miles and it's going to cost me between $150 to $200 a year, that there would be much more engagement of consumers and we would move past that 1,200 users here in the Colorado market much quicker. So what are these barriers that our consumers seem to get stuck on? I mean, I know what I'm stuck on, and that's for me price as a consumer. Mm-hmm. But what are those things and how can we engage consumers into these conversations and say, hey, you know, if we could really move this up the chain a little bit differently or start this conversation a little bit differently, I think you would see much more consumer-driven push in this area, yes?
Well, one of the things that we're not used to as consumers is thinking about the total cost of ownership for a vehicle. Typically, we go into the dealership and we look at the sticker on the car.
Yeah.
And that is the cost that we're focused on. We don't think about what the cost of owning that car is going to be for the next 10 years.
That's
right?
valid.
So one of the tasks that we have in front of us here is to educate people so that they do begin to think about the cost of ownership rather than just the purchase price. Because when you look at the cost of ownership for 10 years and you're saving $1,000 a year on your fuel, that's $10,000 right there.
Sure.
Yeah.
And if you keep the car for 15 years, it's $15,000. That goes a long way to offsetting the incremental cost of the vehicle. The sticker price has a shock value to it.
Sure.
Because people will look at a Nissan Leaf and they look at there's a comparable Nissan vehicle, I forget what it's called, the Versa or something like that. You look at the two of them and the Leaf has a $12,000 higher price tag.
Sure.
That $12,000 is for the battery, which you don't have in the other car. And most people would stop right there.
But then I think between what you said, there are the rebates and tax incentives to it, which then offset that $12,000. But then if I heard what you said correctly, Bob, that the cost of ownership over time, the Leaf ends up being the more cost-efficient, better vehicle to drive than buying your Versa outright and putting fuel in it.
Definitely.
Wow.
Definitely. By thousands of dollars. That's the thing. It's not just a marginal benefit.
Sure.
It's by thousands of dollars. And the tax credits are really critical to this.
Yeah.
Because there's a federal tax credit of up to $7,500 and a state tax credit of up to $6,000. And they're incremental.
So that right there is the $12,000 difference in the two cars.
Almost all of it.
Yeah.
Well, plus if you're driving a hybrid and you're using, say you're an urban driver, so you mostly use I don't know how far you can drive on just the battery, but it seems like you have less wear and tear on your combustion engine. So does that factor in that you have less maintenance costs as well? Or how does that work? Do you know? Do we know
keep in mind with a hybrid, the latest Toyota Prius has a new battery in it that gets you about 16 miles.
Yeah,
on
so
the battery,
for a typical urban driver, maybe you would be able to.
So for some people who are only going back and forth to school, driving the kids to school, doing their grocery shopping, maybe going to the movies, that 16 miles is going to be enough for maybe 80 or 90% of their driving. When they go on the longer trip, they're going to the ski resorts or going camping for the summer or whatever. Obviously, that's not going to do it. And the hybrid makes up the difference because then you can burn gasoline. But you can still save a lot of money if you're driving only on the battery.
Right.
But for some people, what makes sense is to have one car that they use for the long trips, and then another car for the driving around town.
Yeah.
And that can be your electric car. And what you don't often think about is that most of the miles that you drive in a year, if you're the average driver driving 11,000 miles, only 1,000 of that is going to be the long trip.
Yeah.
And the rest of it is the driving around town.
Sure.
And that's where you save.
Yeah, and then that seems to probably have the bigger impact on our ozone and like that sort of concentrated urban driving. If we could, it seems to me, I'm sure you know the numbers, but if we could transition from a lot of the combustion fuel engines to more electric vehicles, at least in the urban areas, that we would have at least better air.
Oh, we would have much better air. If you think about it, automobiles are the most important source of air pollution because the emissions happen where we are.
Yeah.
You know, they're not from a power plant stack that's 20 miles outside of town. It's right there in the street, next to the sidewalk, where your kids are walking to the school or riding their bicycles, or you're, walking down the street with the baby carriage or whatever,
Yeah.
the stroller. And so if we get rid of the emissions right there in the street, it makes a huge difference, because we will help solve the ozone problem, and we'll get rid of the air toxics like benzene, which is an important source of cancer risk. For most people. That's their major source of exposure for cancer. If you're not a smoker,
Yeah, wow.
your major source of exposure for cancer is tailpipe emissions. So if we get rid of that, it has big health benefits for all of us. And then there's the climate benefits. We reduce the CO2 emissions. First of all, an electric motor is 40% more efficient than an internal combustion engine. So right there we get a 40% hit. We reduce our energy use by 40% just getting into an electric vehicle.
Yeah, that's amazing.
That's amazing.
Yes, and most people have no idea about that. But then what we're doing is using electricity, which in itself is generated with a much higher level of efficiency than an internal combustion engine. An internal combustion engine, at best, the most efficient engines, convert about 20% of the energy in the gasoline into motive power.
I didn't know that either.
Whereas a power plant converts about 40% of the energy in the fuel into electricity. And then when you get to an electric vehicle, you're using 40% less energy for each mile you drive. So the whole system is more efficient. And even though we're burning coal to generate electricity, for half of the electricity in Colorado, for example, it's coal.
Right, sure.
Roughly. In other states, like back in Ohio, it's 90% it's coal. But because the electric motor is so much more efficient, you're using less energy, you get a benefit even though the electricity comes from coal. And then what's more important to keep in mind is that as we clean up the grid, as we switch from coal to natural gas, we get a 50% reduction in CO2 emissions. As we switch from natural gas to solar and wind power, we get a 100% reduction. So your electric vehicle, year by year, will get cleaner.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Yes, it is. Well, Bob, I want to come back about, here at ICOSA, you know, everything we do is really about trying to make the world a better place for our kids, for our grandkids, for those generations to come. And it's really about those organizations that are creating those collaborations to get that done. And obviously SWEEP is doing that, and you guys are sort of leading the charge here in the Rockies in this area. Does the growth of the industry really depend on these unique public-private partnerships that you guys are putting together? And if so, you know, what do you need? Where can people come in, step up, put their shoulder to the wheel, and help push the needle forward?
I think the most important thing that any one person can do is seriously investigate replacing your gasoline vehicle with an electric vehicle. There is no other decision that you can make that will do more to reduce your carbon footprint and to improve the economics of your family than to make that transition.
And I'd like to point out that my kids would probably be at school on time for a good number of more days, because I always forget I need gas. I'm like, oh, shoot, I need gas. If I could plug in at night, they would be set.
Right.
You would be set. Well, and I love that you talked about improving the economics of families, which is certainly something that's so huge right now.
Absolutely.
As we transition away from what's gone on in the job markets and where we're headed now. And it's so refreshing to see the big industries, those big boys in Detroit and the guys on the East Coast that manufacture these cars are listening, and they do understand that there is something that needs to be done. And I'm imagining that, you know, if SWEEP and other organizations like SWEEP around the country do need assistance, that you would take that feedback and welcome support. Yes.
Well, there are so many benefits from making this kind of a choice. And different people have different priorities. Now, for some people, establishing our energy independence, weaning us off from reliance upon the Middle East in order to drive our kids to school in the morning, is a high priority. And if we keep in mind that we are spending roughly $350 billion a year to import petroleum into this country, we're just sucking the wealth out of our economy and sending it abroad to people who do not have our interests at stake.
That don't like us so much.
Yeah.
And so if we can switch our system so that we're generating that energy here and creating jobs in the process, using our own sources of wind and solar and natural gas to generate that electricity, we're keeping that $350 billion in our economy. And that will create even more jobs.
Yeah.
When we think about what kind of world we're creating for our kids, it's not just the climate and the air pollution, but also, are we creating real jobs that will support them so they can have families? And this is part of that. This is part of getting us off this addiction that we have. You know, even President Bush called it an addiction. If we can cut that link and become our own producers of the energy that we use in our cars, it's a huge benefit for our families and the economy and our grandchildren. You know, we're all, it's across the board.
Absolutely.
We benefit.
Yeah, I think that this conversation has been really good to point out those things. You know, for me, I was worried about, okay, if I get an electric vehicle and I'm plugging it at home, it was the coal. I'm like, well, I don't want to I don't want to run my car by coal, but I think that is a great point that you point out, that we're not powering it by coal, that it's actually a mix of, first of all, it's a mix of energy sources. It's also much more efficient, and then also you're cutting out those emissions that come specifically from petroleum. And I just think that is where I was getting hung up. It wasn't really necessarily the cost. I just want to make the best choice of where I'm going to go with it, and I've been just waiting. So thank you very much for pointing that out, because that is really one of the major concerns, and I know I talked to a lot of people that's the same thing.
But if you're also, if you really want to go beyond the coal, you can do it right now by putting a solar system on the roof of your house, and plugging your car into your roof, and powering your car from the sun.
Yeah.
You can do it now.
Yep.
And you don't have to spend $35,000 anymore to put the solar system on your roof with this new lease financing situations that the industry is offering.
Yeah.
If you haven't done a program on that yet, you should.
Yeah.
Because this is a huge breakthrough.
Well,
in
Bob,
that industry.
we have to go. I have to say thank you so much for shedding so much light on this conversation, and the conversation of improving the economics, the environment, energy, jobs, and stopping the addiction to true petroleum-fired vehicles, and really taking a look at clean vehicles. And Bob, people can find you guys at the Southwest Energy Efficiency Project in Boulder, Colorado. That's SWEEP, or SWenergy.org. That's SWenergy.org. And Bob, thank you so much for taking the time and spending so much time enlightening us on this conversation. It's such an important conversation.
Thank you.
And Kelly, as always, thank you so much. We'll go forward, and I know we're working on shows with some of the manufacturers of these vehicles going forward, and I think that will bring some enlightening perspective to this bigger conversation as well. Yeah,
we're going to have some upcoming shows, very exciting, and also with the project manager of the electric vehicle project. So we'll talk to them more about how this rollout would look, and try to get more consumers engaged and get the information out there. So thank you again for having me.
Thank you, as always, Kelly. To learn more about Kelly or to read her blog, rmenergyblog.blogspot.com, or to learn more about the work that ICOSA Magazine and ICOSA Media do, go to theicosamagazine.com. Have a great weekend, and check out new energy vehicles. These clean energy vehicles will change